Hi everyone, it's Moana here, and I just love reading stories about the seaside and sailing across the sea. And I want to share one of those stories with you today. Today I'm going to be reading a story called Sandboat by Burley Doherty. And if you're sitting comfortably, we will begin. Joe filled 2 buckets with wet sand and carried them up to where his mum and dad were sitting in their stripy deck chairs. "Cover your arms up, Joe," his mum said. "Don't you and get sunburnt?" She was shiny in the suntanner like a big pink dolphin. "Don't wander off," his dad said, "or you'll get lost." He took his shoes and socks off and wiggled his toes like crabs in the sand. Ooh, that reminds me like Tomato, the crab. Joe fetched some wet sand and tipped it out of the bucket. "Don't tip that sand out near me," Mum said. "It'll get in my eyes." Dad said, "Don't get it in your hair, Joe, or you'll have to have a bath later." Joe fetched more sand and tipped it out. "Don't bring any more up here. That wet sand's over there," his mum said. "You've got enough," said Dad. "Leave some for other people," his mum said. Joe stood up. The tide was coming in like a long brown snuffling creature. He ran down with his buckets and filled them up again. He stood his pile and dolloped the new sand down on top. "Stop chucking that sand about," his mum said. She closed her eyes and yawned. Joe picked up his red spade and dug a hole in the middle of the sand pile. He patted the sides. "Don't get your hands muddy," Dad said, half asleep. Joe dug and built and built. He wasn't quite sure what he was making, except that it was rounded and hollow inside and had a little built up like seat. And it was long. The sun grew high and hot. The sea snuffled nearer. "Don't get wet," Mum murmured, and fell fast asleep. Dad snored. "Don't," he rumbled. All of a sudden, Joe knew what he was building. It was a boat. Ooh, I do love boats. I hope it was as lovely as the one I used to sail across the sea to Montanui. It was definitely a boat. He was excited now. He ran from side to side and all around, adding bits and more sand, patting the sides and rubbing them down to make it round. It was a beautiful boat. Ooh, I love boats. I wish we could see a picture of it. Do you like boats? He stuck a long white gull feather on the front bit. He lay flat on his belly and blew the feather, and it fluttered just like a flag. He stuck shells along the side and in a line. I love collecting shells on the seaside. Do you collect shells when you go to the beach? Then he stood up. The brown snuffling tide was almost in. He climbed into his sandboat and sat on the seat. That was only just about big enough for him. Slowly the sea crept around him. Joe watched as the water trickled as far as his dad's bare toes. But he didn't wake them up. It dribbled around Mum's bag of sandwiches, but he didn't wake her up either. Joe wriggled in his sandy seat. The sea was all around him now. And then Joe's boat began to move. At first it was just a little rocking movement. And then it seemed to lift and sway like a swing, gently up, gently down. And then it was floating. It really was floating. Now that's amazing, isn't it? Maybe next time you go to the beach, you should build your own sandboat and see if you can sail across the sea too. The white feather fluttered like a real flag. Joe sailed past the men and women and dogs who were paddling around him in the sea. He sailed past the children who were jumping up and down and splashing and shrieking. He sailed past the bobbing heads of all the swimmers, past them, far, far out to sea. He trailed his hands over the edge and felt the waves slapping his fingers. He could feel the spray trickling down his cheeks. He laughed out loud, and high above him the seagulls laughed too. He looked over his shoulder and saw far behind him the tiny figures on the beach. He could only just see his mum and dad fast asleep in the deck chairs. That part reminds me of the part in my film when I didn't know how far I'll go. And at this point, it doesn't seem like Joe knows how far he'll go either. Fishes drifted around him, flashing like stars in the water. The waves sparkled in the sunlight. When he closed his eyes, he could hear the whales singing to each other. Miles and miles below him, he sang back to them as loud as he could, at the top of his voice, louder than he had ever sung before. A dolphin jumped out the water and clapped his fins at him. Far away, he could see a huge ship, like a castle, in the water. It was an ocean liner. It loomed up to him, rocking his little sandboat with giant white waves it made. His dolphin leapt in the air with excitement. Boom! Went the ship's loud hooter. Toot! Shouted Joe. Toot! Toot! The captain on the deck and saluted him. Joe stood up in his sandboat and saluted back. Just like that. That's fine craft you have, Captain, the captain shouted. Thank you, Captain, shouted Joe. He felt as round as an egg with pride. You going far? The captain shouted. Miles, shouted Joe. Are you going far? Australia, said the captain. Don't get lost, Joe shouted, and the captain laughed. You know, I've never been to Australia. Have you ever been to Australia? I might, said the captain. It's a long way to Australia. You can borrow my dolphin if you like, said Joe, and his dolphin flicked his tail and swam off towards the liner to lead it all the way to Australia. Joe waved to the liner till it was out of sight. He looked over the side of the boat and saw the fishes swimming like seagulls in the water. He looked up and saw the seagulls floating in the sky like fishes. And all of a sudden, the boat gave a little bump, and Joe realised he had landed back on shore. The tide was trickling away from him like a long snuffling creature scurrying back home. It whispered away like smoke. Joe climbed out of his boat. It was strange to be standing still again on land. Mum and Dad were just beginning to wake up. I hope you didn't wander off, said Dad. And I hope you haven't eaten my sandwiches, said Mum. She looked in her bag, just looked at them. They were wet. Why didn't you tell us the tide was coming in, said Dad. We could have floated away on the deck chairs, said Mum. And Joe smiled to himself and didn't say a word. The end. So I hope you enjoyed reading that story. I love reading stories so I can escape to the sea, and I hope you do too. Perhaps next time you go to the seaside, you can build your own sandboat and see if you can sail across the sea too. That's all from me for today. I hope you enjoyed. Bye!